So, hello and welcome here at the stream organized by SAE Athens. I am Konstantinos Dimopoulos, the head of the games department, and with me is Stefano Gualeni. Thank you, Stefano. Thanks so much for coming. And he will be here talking about games and philosophy. Stefano is a professor at the University of Malta at the Institute of Digital Game, and he's also teaching at the Laguna Beach. Has made several very interesting games. Has written some way more interesting books, mainly dealing about philosophy and how it interacts with gaming. And I think that today he will be mainly talking about his latest work and the thoughts that go along with it. So, Stefano, if you're ready, we can start, and people can just prepare their questions. We'll have a short Q&A, a discussion afterwards.
Right. And before I share my slides, and please let me know if they're shared correctly, I would like to acknowledge the fact, first of all, thank you, but also acknowledge the fact that it is a bit absurd, right, to be talking about games and philosophy and these kind of lofty thoughts where two genocidal wars are going on at the same time. And so it feels a little trivial to talk about my book in this cultural milieu, if you will. At the same time, I think that if we have hope to counter what's happening, as in restore some faith in humanity and maybe leave behind stuff like violence, oppression, nationalism, tribalism, and all these things that apparently are still with us. Perhaps the humanities are something that can, in a way, help us, or we can hope they can help us go beyond those ideas and maybe evolve as societies and as people. So with that said, I hope that my little contribution will be something that gives you a little hope and maybe shows the importance of being philosophical and thinking about how we think, how we know concepts like justice, identity, knowledge again. So I hope I can show that this is important, and even in this desperate time like this one, it is something worth considering. Is that okay?
Yes, I fully agree with the way you look at things. I mean, those might be dark times, but that does not mean we have to abandon all faith and all pleasure also. There's no point in doing that.
You said it much shorter and better than I. So I'm going to share my slides. Tell me if they're visible and if it's correctly showing. So I should be doing this share, and it should be this one here. So
Nico, can we?
This is visible?
Good. Yes, it is. So I will be leaving you on your own for a while, and we'll be back on right after the presentation. So thanks again. The floor is yours.
Many thanks. So hello, everybody. And once again, thank you for having me here in Athens, at least in spirit. This is called an experiment in theory fiction, and it's about a number of things you will see. So as Konstantinos already said, I work at the Institute of Digital Games at the University of Malta, which is that little island in the circle. We are running one of the biggest research centers in Europe concerned with games, players, and so on. I also work in California at Laguna College, and you might have heard about my work because I am a kind of academic that, in a way, produces games as academic outputs. There's not many people doing that yet. You might have played some of my old titles, such as Something Soup Something or Here. In any case, if you're interested in knowing more, you will find all of my games and all of my papers for free on my website. I believe knowledge and also small experimental games should be free, so you can find them here, use them in your class, play them just for fun, and so on. As a researcher and as an academic, I also produce more traditional forms of academic output, such as books and more books, and even more books. So I also do academia the traditional way. And today we're also going to be talking about one of my latest works, which is called The Clouds, an Experiment in Theory Fiction. I am based in Malta, as I said, and also The Clouds is the book is a fiction that is based in Malta, that is here. But the story I'm going to tell you today has a longer heritage. It goes back a few millennia, and it, well, can you believe it? It originally started in Athens, in Greece. To be more precise, the things I'm going to tell you have an origin at around 370 BC, where a guy named Plato, which you might have heard about even if you didn't study philosophy, as, let's say, the godfather of Western written thought, composed a dialogue called the Phaedrus. Why am I talking about a dialogue here and not a book? Well, in case you didn't know, like Plato wrote mostly in this form, which is the dialogue, right? In which he would tell about the encounters between his master and his, let's say, mentor, Socrates, another Athenian philosopher, and some prominent figures in Athens. In these kind of dialogues, Socrates talks with Athenian people about very important philosophical themes such as courage, justice, truth, and so on and so forth. Why are we talking about the Phaedrus in particular? Well, the Phaedrus is an interesting dialogue, and it features two people, two characters, so to speak, because it's highly fictional as an idea. And these two figures are great philosopher Socrates, as I said, the mentor of Plato, and a young Athenian scholar called Phaedrus, which is the name of the dialogue again. Why is it interesting? For a number of reasons, and the first being that it's the only dialogue among the roughly 35 written by Plato that does not take place in the city of Athens. In fact, this dialogue takes place in summer, and Socrates is in the countryside looking for some cooling down, so to speak. In fact, the dialogue is set in the valley of the Issus, and the two characters are speaking about certain philosophical topics. It's interesting to note that Phaedrus just came back from Athens himself, and he's carrying with him a parchment, a roll of, let's say, paper or quasi-paper with a speech written on it. It is a speech that he listened to the day before in Athens, and it's a speech about love by a famous speaker. So a lot of this discussion between the two people is really about the text that Phaedrus is carrying, that one with the big red arrow. When discussed academically, this Socratic dialogue is brought up in a number of different forms and for a number of different reasons. One of the key themes of this speech and of this dialogue is homoerotic love with your students. So part of the discussion is about how, as a mentor, you should have sex with your male students and how you should make sex with your students and which style and which kind of attachment you should adhere to. But you understand that that part of the Phaedrus didn't age particularly well. And this is not going to be something I'm going to be discussing today. Otherwise, I might get in trouble myself. So what other themes are in the Phaedrus? Another common theme that is discussed in academia is the idea of the immortality of the soul, the immortality of the human spirit. You might have heard of the myth of the winged soul and so on and so forth. But yeah, also this one is not very interesting in relation to what I'm going to talk about today. A very, very common topic for which the Phaedrus is cited and brought up is an opinion of Socrates according to which this new technology, which is text writing, right, which was not previously used in culture in Greece, it starts to be used around that period. According to Socrates, is going to make us stupider to an extent or more forgetful. But also that one has been discussed a lot, and it's not really the key point of this presentation. So why am I talking about the Phaedrus then? All right, in the last 2 pages of this Socratic dialogue, Phaedrus asks a question. He goes, "Hey, Socrates, yes, you're a philosopher, right? Well, yes. So what do you think? Do you think that writing, this new technology, newly introduced in Greek society, is any good for presenting ideas and arguments? And Socrates thinks about it. Now, for context, you need to remember that Socrates never wrote anything, or better, if he did write anything, nothing of his written texts ever reached us. What we know about what Socrates thought and did came to us through other authors such as Plato or Xenophon and so on and so forth. So he didn't write anything that we know as a philosophical work. And he thought that the search for truth was the goal of good philosophy. Only he didn't think that this would be a solved problem at a certain point. He didn't think that this pursuit of truth would be solved once and for all. He thought that it was more like an activity, something dynamic, something that we negotiate with one another in a social context, something that gets us progressively closer to truth, but always needs to be discussed and negotiated. The search for truth that is philosophy needs to be adapted to the social and technical context of a community like that of the Athenian polis. And it needs to align to people's preferences and capabilities, which is why, as I was mentioning before, Socrates taught and philosophized in a famously dialogical way. So through dialogue, through speech, engaging people directly and confronting opinion and negotiating ideas. So I, Stefano, thought, well, Socrates' answer to the question of Phaedrus, whether writing is a good idea, would be a no question, no answer, right? Like it would be like, no, I don't think so. Because if we write it down, that kind of knowledge, that kind of truth that we're after might be, in a way, crystallized in a form of text and become dogmatic. It will, in a way, stop being part of this social discussion that we're having. And guess what? I was pretty surprised that that is not the way in which Socrates says no to writing. He does say no to writing, but for another reason, kind of a selfish reason. Socrates says, well, if I write a text and I give it away and they read it without the presence of the author, people might misunderstand it, misinterpret it, maybe even maliciously change its meaning. And I'm not there to tell them, like, you're wrong, you need to fix this, and that's not a good way to read what I wrote. So in a way, Socrates didn't really trust his readers or trust his readers not to manipulate his text. Whereas if he's there in person, he can fix the argument, he can explain himself better, come up with better examples, and so on and so forth. Okay. So in philosophy, we continued instead to write books, despite of what Socrates thought. And ironically, as I mentioned before, it's thanks to the creation of books and the preservation of writing in that way that we can understand what Socrates thought and believed in back in the days of classical Greece. And we continued to write books and even more books. I'm also guilty of producing this kind of philosophical output, if you will. Which is not strange because if you think about it, I don't know how many here are professional academics, but you probably know that the ways in which we are hired, we are promoted, we are evaluated is based on theoretical texts, right? It is almost a given that we need to produce these kind of objects as philosophers. And then comes Friedrich Kittler. Friedrich Kittler is a German philosopher who thought something along these lines in a recent paper of his. He goes something like that. Philosophy is the activity of thinking clearly and thinking things through and being self-reflexive and questioning everything and making sure that the way in which we understand and think is solid and grounded, right? And yet, he thinks, we have kind of forgotten that question, right? The question of Phaedrus. We kind of stopped asking ourselves the question of whether text and writing books and writing articles and book chapters is a valid and particularly good way of communicating culture and philosophy in particular. So he said, we almost forgot about this question. And it's strange that philosophy didn't question its own form if it's such a reflexive, critically engaged discipline. The same opinion is supported also by a number of other scholars who think, including Ian Bogost, but with many others examples that I could have brought up, considering writing in academia to be a sort of institutional dogma for the reasons that I mentioned already, which are the fact that we consider that to be true and good culture. That is the measure by which we get promotions and positions and so on and so forth. So we haven't questioned this very, very much. However, some parts of academia did question a little bit. And as a matter of fact, some methodologies that go beyond text as a theoretical tool were devised. Think, for example, if you studied art or artistic practice or performance or theater studies or even film studies, how some of the contents of academic disciplines can be expressed creatively with the production of artifacts or commentaries or portfolios or demos or small little chunks of content in another piece of medium. If you're in design, you probably heard about research through design. In general, I'm talking about the realization of things that go beyond simple text writing. Take this as an example. This is a record by A.D. Carson, who got his Ph.D. in 2017 in hip-hop studies. And he decided to make his Ph.D. into a CD, right? So he made a rap record that encapsulates the entirety of his PhD. So the CD was submitted in fulfillment of his PhD requirements. My own PhD, when I did it back in the days in 2013, consisted of a book and 3 small games. So it is to a degree possible to go beyond text in academic production. There are also several journals, especially in design studies, also in game studies, in which a correct submission or an invited submission includes a demo, a small game, an artifact of some kinds. Now, this is a small example. It's a 2016 journal called Game, the Italian Journal of Game Studies, and that's one example in which the authors were supposed to submit games together with a traditional paper. I'm also among the editors of this one because, well, this is stuff that I care about. This is important stuff for me. And I think I'm also in a nice position to try and do that because I have a dual background, so to speak. I am originally an architect. I worked in the games industry for about 12 years as a game designer. And then I went back to academia to study more philosophy. And I find that the two things are not necessarily so separate or antagonistic to one another. And as I'm going to show you, as a matter of fact, I made some games that in a way demonstrate or redigest or make some philosophical arguments in a way that is playful and interactive. You can find those stupid games here. And one of them is called Necessary Evil. You might have played it, perhaps. It's 10 years old in December, so almost a 10 years old experimental game. You might have played something soup something, or another one called Here. And I know Konstantinos, for example, uses this one in class, a game that I made with Nele van der Mosselaar called Doors the Game. Allow me to show you something about these games. So Necessary Evil was designed as a way to make it experientially clear for the player that the game worlds in which we play are very idealistic constructs. And I use some thoughts of Berkeley, the British philosopher, to prove my point. So in a way, by playing the game, you play an argument by Berkeley. Okay. Something soup something does a very similar thing and criticizes the way in which language limits how we think and the impossibility of arriving at analytical categories of many of the things that we surround ourselves with. And this was inspired by the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein. Doors that I also mentioned, in case you played it, you know that it's full of philosophical reflection on themes such as fictionality and virtuality and so on and so forth. What is the point that I'm making here? Can we use games and digital interactions in general, or virtual worlds more broadly speaking, as philosophical tools? I believe so. And I believe you can, in a way, test it by yourself by playing these games. Am I making the point that this is a way of doing philosophy that goes beyond text and we should leave text behind? Of course, that's not what I'm saying. For example, let's go back to Necessary Evil. Necessary Evil has quite a lot of text, right? You can read about what I mean if you look into the library of the game. And also on the website of the game, you can find a theoretical piece that I published about the game. So in a way, the experience of the game, or rather of Necessary Evil, is composed by some parts playable artifact and some other parts into a theoretical, more canonical, more classical philosophical text. That's kind of interesting, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that it's not either or, is the fact that we could potentially leverage the good qualities of both at the same time. Something, something, soup, something, similar idea. There is text in the game, some that lead the narrative forward, some that is helpful to make the point in the game. But on the website, you can also read the idea of the game as a traditional philosophical paper. Finally, the same thing with doors. Some of the points of Doors, the game, are made through text. Some of its narrative is narrated through text. And on the website, you can also read a paper exactly about what is this game and what kind of communicative and intentional messages it tries to send. As you see, also the paper was written with Nele van der Mosselaar. So to be more accurate here, my point is that we can look at more media to express our ideas and to do culture, more broadly speaking. And we shouldn't restrict ourselves to the exclusivity and the institutional dogma, as I said, of theoretical texts. This is something that I discussed in my PhD that then became a book in its own right. So I'm not saying games are the next philosophical tools that will solve everything, but it's something that we can put next to text when we need to make a point about agency, interaction, immersion, the experience of space and action, or when we make a point about video games, they're particularly good at that one. But that is not what this particular speech is about. Today, I'm going to talk to you, or try to explain and maybe make you interested about this new experiment, which is a science fiction novel. And that's kind of weird. It's not a game, but it kind of contains games. Well, let me get to it. It's an experiment in theory fiction. What do I mean by that? The book itself contains parts of theory and parts of fiction. It is an experiment with, let's say, academic publishing. And in this case, what I'm trying to work with is not try to look for another medium that I can do philosophy with, like I did with video games, for example, or like A.C. Carson did with his rap Ph.D. Record. In this case, the medium is the same, so it's still a book published by an academic publisher. But what happens here is that it's not traditional in the way that I use the book. Let me explain you what I mean. This is a text, but it's not just academic text and theory. There's a weird combination of things. So let me explain to you why this particular book is original and interesting. You might, and in my opinion, you would be correct into thinking, well, you know, Stefano, using fiction in the context of philosophy and communicating culture is not all that new. Think about the Phaedrus to begin with. Like, that's one of the oldest philosophical texts published in ancient Greece, or written in ancient Greece, rather. And we still read in it today, and we still consider it to be super important and interesting, and yet that is a piece of fiction. Like, we do not know if this, for example, encounter between Socrates and Phaedrus actually did happen? No idea. If you're familiar with Kierkegaard as like the famous Danish existential philosopher, you probably know that several of his books are fictions narrated by a different person than himself, and so on and so forth. Like Diary of a Seducer, for example, is a good instance of that idea. And in case you read it, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig is a very philosophical book written as a piece of fiction. So this is not particularly new. And the philosophical use in fiction goes way beyond just these semi-autobiographical or quasi-realistic books. We can find philosophical topics, themes, and arguments in a lot of science fiction books, such as, for example, some of the books by Ursula Le Guin or Octavia Butler. In The Existentialists that wrote many theater pieces, but also many novels and short stories next to their traditional and canonical academic production. So as far as using fiction is concerned, what I have done was not particularly new. Even more so if you think that in philosophy, the idea of a thought experiment, that is a fictional setup that allows us and helps us to think a problem through, to confront and like deal intuitively with certain situations, are absolutely works of fiction, right? There was never a trolley problem. The idea of a swamp man created in a swamp by a lightning is completely fictional, and so is the idea of Mary's room. We never did indeed lock somebody in a completely black and white room. Okay, so philosophy and fiction have been married since the beginning of written philosophy in ancient Greece, at the very least. And so you might be asking, in which way is yours an experiment, Stefano, and in which ways can it be considered to be an original idea or something that adds something to this discussion? Here is the idea. With the clouds, you do not only read fiction. What I propose to you is something hybrid, or something that I called hybrid textuality. So I'll make use of the text between the two covers of my book in a way which is hybrid. It's not only theory, it's not only fiction. Let me explain you what I mean. Think about the clouds as a cocktail, right? I mean, wouldn't we always think about philosophical works as cocktails? I like to do so, but anyway. In the cocktail called the clouds, which is a mix of things, we find the following ingredients. There's 8 parts of fiction. Those are the 8 chapters of the science fiction novella. That is purely fiction. That's great. There are 3 essays in the book that are talking about the same themes, but written in a traditional fashion, in a canonical fashion, in the forms of theoretical articles, right? Essays, chapters, what have you. And at the end, we added a dash of meta-reflection. So there's a whole part of the book that is about how these 2 parts of the book, fiction and non-fiction, talk to one another. I'm going to present it to you in a slightly different fashion. There is the clouds, which is the novel. There is a part of the clouds, which are 3 essays. And there's a reflexive part in which I speak with my own voice, Stefano, the researcher, the writer of this book, and try to explain in which way this book works. I want to thank, in case she's here, Rebecca Portelli for these beautiful illustrations, which, I mean, there are more illustrations in the book, but those are particularly lovely. Thank you again, Rebecca. So I hope that these 3 pictures show you more or less what I mean. Beyond the 2 covers of the book, there is a part of fiction, a part of essays, and a part of self-reflection in which I speak directly to the reader. Also, in this case, there are other examples in philosophy of authors trying something freaky and hybrid like the way I did. Only in this case, I could only find 3 or 4 examples in the whole history of written philosophy. One of them is called The Dream Weaver, which is a novel by Jack Bowen, in which the philosophical part comes in the form of footnotes to the text, which is completely fiction. So you can read this book entirely as a fiction, or you can stop every time there is a note for some more traditional, classical, fully explained point made by Jack Bowen, who was also a philosopher. A friend of mine, Federico Campagna, wrote this book called Prophetic Culture, which alternates in its structure on theory chapters and fiction chapters, theory chapters and fiction chapters throughout the book. So you can get a feel for the same topics and a treatment of the same themes in multiple different ways throughout the book. And finally, well, I could go on because I met a couple of other books in my research, but this is quite popular. It came out together with my previous book in 2022, and it's called Philosophy Through Science Fiction Stories. So this book is particularly interesting because we have science fiction stories written by science fiction authors who then comment on the cultural value of their own stories. And then we have philosophers commenting on the stories and the comments. So it's a hybrid text doing many, many things at once. It provides us a topic or it presents a discussion in the form of fiction, then one from the point of view of the author, and an additional reflection from the point of view of professional philosophers that had nothing to do with the writing of the stories. And I thought that was pretty interesting and experimental, and it was quite illuminating to read this book, but actually all the three of them. So what is the point that I'm trying to make with the clouds? I hope it's pretty obvious at this point, which is, well, we've been doing philosophy without thinking very hard as to why we were doing it almost exclusively with theoretical texts. And I hope that with the clouds, but also with my philosophical video games and my reflections on virtual worlds as viable and valuable avenues for culture and philosophy to express itself, I demonstrated to you that there's more to philosophy, to thinking, to contemporary culture than just boring, old, theoretical, hard to read texts. And perhaps through the help of fiction, we can make some points more intuitively accessible, more personally relevant, more memorable, and so on and so forth. So in this particular book, I try to use text, not only in the theoretical sense, but also in the fictional sense, and in a strange combination of the two. I could tell you more about the plot, but I mean, it's not a very long book, and you can definitely pick it up in your library. Currently, it is a very expensive book because this is the nature and the fraud of academic publishing. But if you're interested in reading a digital version, you can definitely contact me, and I'll be more than happy to let you have it for free. And I'm ever so happy if somebody, in a way, reads it and gets challenged or challenge me back with some philosophical ideas and how I put them together in this small volume. So I hope I got you interested in playing my games and trying this new experiment of mine, which came out just a couple of months ago. So I would like to thank you for listening. And in case you have any questions or ideas for me, I'm very happy and open to listen to you for once. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much, Stefano. That was actually fascinating. Seriously, makes
Thank
me
you.
feel bad for not having finished the book. But yeah, I will have to. I have countless questions, but before I start with them,
I hope the audio and the video were both fine and
oh
people could
yes,
follow.
yes, I think they were fine. I also checked it on YouTube. So before I start, I mean, the first question is I can definitely see right down on the chat is Revenger asking whether they could actually reach you directly for the book.
Oh, Revenger, somebody picked up like Alistair Reynolds, if I'm not mistaken. But yes, you can contact me like on YouTube or sending me an email, and I'll be happy to share it with you. I wrote this book so that people could read it and get inspired and maybe get to do philosophy in their own particular ways. So I'm happy to let you have it.
Excellent. So thanks a lot for that. And while people start thinking about their questions, because mainly people are telling us like, thanks so much, and that was lovely, and how interesting.
We also don't have to have questions and answers. We can have a conversation or talk about something silly. I mean, don't force your audience to ask questions. I'm also happy
No.
without questions. We can just look at each other and
Okay, I mean, for
enjoy
example,
it.
Aphrodite wants to get educated, as apparently she's been doing for the past 2 years, getting educated. But no, I really want to ask you is like, do you feel that the correct or like the most strategic choice of medium can help you be more persuasive? I mean, would it actually work? Would I don't know Marx be more effective if he were presented in a more thought-provoking or dialectical or whatever apt but different way?
Um, the first answer to this question is that perhaps persuasion is not all there is to knowledge, right?
Hmm.
So there are certain things that you don't need necessarily to be convinced of, right? Or to be persuaded of. So as long as persuasion goes, that, for example, the use of self-involving fiction or art or appealing stories and narrative is the oldest trick in a book to get somebody interested in something. So potentially this is an answer, which is, it seems that obviously, yes, if rhetorics is our goal, then making it more pleasant, more snappy, more relevant to us is an answer. But take this, perhaps that is the most interesting part of your question, if I could judge it in that way. Um, Frederick Jameson talked about um, the fact that what we having an issue with imagination, in the sense that the famous quote goes, "It is easier for us to imagine the end of the world than the
Mm.
end of capitalism." For example, we could find it hard to know what a government looks like if we were to abandon democracy, or, well, democracy is not a good idea. Let's say private property. What would it be like to have a government in a nation without private property? What would it be like to have breakfast in a country without private property? Right now, we cannot promptly, unless we are political scholars or economists and can, in a way, like simulate these course of ideas, it might not be immediately clear what that change in our society would mean to us and whether it's desirable or not. Perhaps a game or interactive medium could help shed light on ideas that we don't have in our minds, could foster intuitions that are not readily available to us and function in ways that, for example, philosopher Daniel Dennett would call intuition pumps, right? So if some of the problems with our politics right now is that we cannot easily envisage an alternative, these could be media that generate more accessible alternatives to the status quo. Therefore, potentially parading or proposing themselves as utopian tools of some
Mm.
kind. So I believe that subjectively, it's a lot harder to envisage these kind of things, and perhaps things like games, movies, fictions of different kinds, or models even, or just virtual worlds that work in a particular fashion, could be aids to our imagination and intuition to perhaps propose changes.
Yeah,
Does that?
yes, I think that I actually fully agree with that. That they can be tools of liberating one's imagination. I mean, they
Right.
can help you see something that has never been done and see it presented to you as a concrete reality. For example, in a video game or in a virtual reality, you know, escapade or something.
Or something that you need to deal with and, in a way, adapt yourself to and start thinking along those lines that are maybe not common. So some would say that today's political issue and political climate is not as much a political issue, but an issue with our incapability to imagine things to be otherwise, which
Mm.
I sort of tend to agree with. In that sense, maybe the humanities can serve as a um, antidote to imperialism, selfishness, oppression, and those kind of things. We can maybe have some clues to think otherwise. Think, for example,
Mm.
of a very famous quote by Ursula Le Guin, which I mentioned in the talk for the Dispossessed book. And this is not a quote from the Dispossessed, but she thought that even the something, I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, even the rule and the power of kings seemed once during the Middle Ages to be something that's always been the case, and this is incredible, and this is just how society is and how it's organized. But they also came to fall, right, with changes in society, culture, literacy, and so on and so forth. So why can't fiction help us go past the current time and the current conceptualization of humanity and society. I think there is potential there. At the same time, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go on like a little bit, because at the same time, think about how often we've been repeating this to ourselves. And yet we had a First World War and then a Second World War, and nothing changed. And now we're having very similar scenarios and social segregation and violence, oppression, and like outright genocide, if you ask me. It looks like we didn't learn very, very much. So does it mean the humanities fail here and we should stop? Or do we need more humanities?
Well, I will not answer that. And to be honest, I mean, I do frankly believe that we are still in our prehistory, effectively. But that's fine. I'll just pass on a question by Morella, which is, what are your thoughts about using games as a tool or even a method for traditional education, which is by definition didactic? I mean, it is meant to teach you specific things, and you're allowed to only, which is interesting because you're allowed to only question them up to a point in any sort of traditional education. I mean, this is given to you as the more or less the truth, and now you get to engage with it, maybe criticize it, but that's it. So, how would you see this sort of application of games?
It is a difficult question because, in a sense, we've seen increased literacy and increased skills in students that are exposed to these kind of things. But personally, in my heart of hearts, I'm a bit like Socrates, and I think that the critical use of this tool, if we can call it tool, might make us more distracted and more stupid and less capable of independent thinking. Not everything is matching numbers and words. Like there are skills that perhaps games are not particularly good at triggering in the current configuration. I'm thinking about introspection or long concentration or staying with a problem for very, very long and try to, in a way, go into a very nuanced relationship with an issue. I agree with maybe the person asking the question that when we're talking about mandatory education and like things that one learn by memory, or there are in a way like techniques that we learn, perhaps video games are a good medium. It starts to become a bit problematic when we get into situations that require us to grow, for example, as individuals, as citizens, as reflexive and self-reflexive people. Then perhaps games might not be the best medium there. Like I personally still find literature and theory to work better, but I'm also an old man, so I don't know exactly whether this is true. Scientifically, it's been proven that there are benefits to learning, but I would say up to a certain point. If you think that everything can be quantified in a performance with feedback, and you need to be reassured that the way is the correct way and that with enough tries you're going to be figuring out, I don't know, quantum physics, perhaps that is not the right way to look at education. So the answer is it's very difficult, perhaps not, yes to a point, and other vague utterances of that kind.
And this is roughly related. This is one of my own questions. I mean, I do find that one of the things that philosophy tends to do is actually take the things that you've already sort of had in your mind in an unformed way and like really clear them up and crystallize them and give you the words and the methods that are not yours but allow you to actually finally express the thing you've been roughly thinking about.
Or methods for countering what you think and bounce your idea against a different perspective. But anyway, becoming aware of how you think and be able to refine your thinking in a critical fashion is crucial to this idea. And not often games give you that reflexive space. They tend to put you into a situation with a guaranteed answer in which you need to act normally quite quickly because the task is normally short or the class is short. So there's a certain paradigm in how we understand games right now, which might not be beneficial to our growth.
So
but there's definitely sorry.
You know, I mean, because I just noticed that Morella, the same person who asked the initial question, is following it up with an interesting point. I don't know how that would be. That would be mostly design and I don't know philosophical problem. But there is. What about interactive games that can actually that are aimed to evolve to evolving your thought? I mean, things that
Nothing against those.
Yeah.
Nothing against those. Like those are the directions in which I was going. And essentially, you're talking about playable thought experiments in which
Mhm.
your assumptions are challenged and you're given time to understand what you do and why you did it in a certain way. Is there an alternative to what we've just done? So it's really about, I mean, design is a key issue here. We cannot necessarily learn very complex subjects with the language of casual games, but we can also develop a more interesting language and a less commercial, less attention-seeking language for game design. Do you know who talked about similar things? David Foster Wallace in relation to television,
Mm.
which of course had a great promise of social transformation, but ended up being something that distracts us and gets us into an ironic, entertained stance and is incapable to move us forward as a populace. So I would say it's a very difficult question, and if she or he has a better answer, I'm all ears. I'm very skeptical, but again, I'm middle-aged man who grew up with books, so it's hard for me to say.
Yeah. So another thing by Tiana or Tihana, sorry, I'm not certain as to how exactly to pronounce it. It's if we were living in a simulated universe, would the quest for existential meaning be a futile pursuit, given that our reality might be governed by external forces beyond our comprehension?
That is a super interesting question, Tiana. And Tiana is a scholar who studies these kind of things like virtual
Okay.
worlds and meaning and so on and so forth. The answer, I mean, the quick answer would be, hey, there's a whole book that awaits you. Why don't you go read it? And because the whole book is about our existential meaning and how to relate to the idea and the possibility that we are simulations. So it's very kind of engaged in that topic. So I would say I'm very happy to discuss it, but maybe on the basis of the book, it's easier because there's already multiple answers being given there. So it's a non-answer. I could talk about this forever, but I would say like Diana, pick up the book and then we talk.
And speaking about the book, there's another question by Amy exactly on how the book is meant to be approached. And the question is like, with the sections in the book working together but also being separate pieces, is there an ideal order of reading you recommend, or
Amy,
is it just
I'm very happy that you're here. Thank you for making time to log in all the way from cold and rainy England. Uh, the idea is that I prepared it editorially so that you need to read the novel first, then the reflection on the novel that prepares you for the essay. So each of the pieces can be read separately, but the essays often build on things that happened on the novel. So my suggestion would be to stick to the way the book is presented to you. So fiction first, reflection second, and classical essays last. Of course, you can decide to go each way. They're supposed to be strictly dependent from one another, but you will find references and cross pollination. So if you do it the way I suggest, it might work better. Thank you again, Amy, for joining this one.
and Ioana is not so much asking as pointing out that we should indeed pay more attention to humanities, and that it might be the only solution, and as would be going back to the basics, which is again something very difficult to argue for in this time and day.
Especially
Very
because if you know, and you probably know what the academic environment is like, as soon as we are in an economical difficulty as a nation or a state or a continent, one of the first things that becomes scarce is funding for these kind of thoughts and philosophy in the humanities, and also jobs are less available for people doing this kind of crazy enterprise. So uh, it's particularly difficult now, and so I agree with the sentiment.
so. Okay, Amy, thanks you so much, and obviously loved the talk, as everyone did,
Thank you
I'm
so
sure.
much. I hope you're gonna like the book when you get to it.
No, another question by Revenger. So this example regarding the television and its application in the end uh, actually reminded him and me too that of all those studies in the early 90s and 2000s that were like so optimistic about how many avenues the internet will open up to us, and eventually it was just doom scrolling through a feed, which is interesting. And what he points out is that while the optimism existed, there were also warnings given out about the dangers of commercializing everything, which exactly is what
You
happened.
find similar reflections still in the context of television in the books of, for example, Neil Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which talks precisely about how television, in a way, isolated us as individuals and removed us from the political debate, essentially. So it became not a means for connection, but rather one of isolation and control. And I feel that we might be in a similar predicament now, with bubbles, with quantification of performance on social media, with yeah, I mean, also like it's super hard. Like it seems like, and this is like a key topic in philosophy of technology, that whenever we introduce a new technology in society, especially one with a impact, such as the internet or printed press or the writing like in ancient Greece or televisions in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s and so on and so forth, we are not fully in control in how that is going to shape social relationship of powers and how it's going to give voice to people and take away the voice to some other people, how they will make certain things more relevant and certain things obsolete. And if you read like Marshall McLuhan, he was already talking about exactly these points in the 60s. So we are not fully in control of our tools, and they change society whether we like it or not. In this case, I mean, with the internet, it seems that the damage done in terms of misinformation and the opposite of mental well-being is quite palpable in everyday life. Like I think you all kind of experience some degree of being affected by how lives are essentially on a screen, and progressively more so.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Though I mean, on the upside, for example, I mean, Twitter can be depressing, but it is also up to a point a free type of media that can help you share like news and stuff about things that are actually being covered up. I mean,
It's
if
hard. It's hard, Konstantinos, to call it a free type of media when all of these
yeah,
outlets are
it's not.
owned by multimillionaires.
They are, but I mean, the thing is that you can get more info about what's going on in Gaza on Twitter than you can in corporate media. It's
I agree.
it's still easier to at least make a blip there.
I was just commenting on the free when you pay with your data and something is censored, some things are censored,
Mm,
and somebody decides who speak and who doesn't. Well, it's still relatively free, and most of the people that ask
yeah,
questions are also on Twitter. That's how I know them. But calling it a free place, it's becoming hard.
yeah. You're right. It's a way too much of an exaggeration.
I agree with you.
Yeah. So anyway, sorry. Question by Yorgos. For the both of us. So, what do you think about introducing philosophy or semiotics as a significant part of game design curriculum in private and public institutions? And then he has like a second different question, which is like, can we invest commercial game design with real considerations of the importance of interpreting games deeply? So, those two.
Would you like to start?
I would say that introducing philosophy in any type of learning environment, because I mean we did have philosophy lessons in the Technical University of Athens, and I deeply feel that they help you understand a lot of things and improve the way you're thinking. So I would say that philosophy would fit in any curriculum, let alone a curriculum that has to do with creative people trying to do creative things and art and conveying ideas. So that's a yes by me. Whether I think that would be plausible, I would say that not as easily in a private institution.
The
So
way I see it is that maybe at the bachelor level, students of that age that undertake game education tend to be more interested in game as an expressive form. But as soon as you move from bachelor to maybe undergrad, postgrad, then perhaps a more thorough reflection and a better engagement with contemporary culture in the form of, let's say, literature, cinema, other media, and also philosophy would be, in my opinion, a necessary step. We tend to take that approach, which is games as part of culture and a factor in culture, not just games for game's sake or games
mm,
as something that you can get a job in. But I think it's easier this step when you start thinking and talking about postgraduate education rather than the bachelor. And the other idea, there are many games that are coming out, and I think we're getting much better as a community of developers and consumer to single out a lot of great productions. I mean, I'm thinking about, say, the return of Obra Dinn, the Talos Principle, you name it, The Witness, games that in a way require you to, in a way, think and observe and reflect and get inspired, not only act and react and pursue violence and pursue optimal performance and optimize resources and all that discussion. So as developers, I think that something is already changing. We well already, despite of everything, realizing that there's a communicative and cultural power in the thing that we're doing. So don't you think that there are already games out there that seem to take this discussion to a level of sophistication that was unprecedented like 10 years ago?
And those games, like many of the games you actually mentioned, but I would also add the second Talos Principle, which is even it goes a bit deeper. It goes on a more societal level. But I mean, those games also showcase that there is a large section of the audience that is willing and craving for this sort of discourse. And people love Disco Elysium, and people love the Talos Principle, and people love
Take also,
Stanley
I don't
Parable.
know, Control, the Stanley Parable, the Beginner's Guide, Alan Wake 2. I mean, there are games that engage with culture, mediality, media, philosophical themes in ways that are non-trivial, I think. And in my opinion, it's becoming more and more the case. So it's true that also the audience is maturing, meaning that the gamers of the 80s and 90s are now older people that have less good reflexes and perhaps less interest in grinding as a 32 level orc, and perhaps more time to think like what it is like to act in this world, and this is an interesting mystery, or that's a cool thing to think about and act upon, rather than who shoots the better, who kicks whose ass, and so on. So developers are growing, getting better educated, the public is growing and getting better educated. So I think it's quite normal and expectable that the level of sophistication of the titles we play will keep increasing.
So wait, there's like a lot of comments.
Oh no.
So Orestes is asking whether you're optimistic about the power of media and games and media in general in such topics, or whether they're getting lost in a sea of super commercialized game development, same as TV and media is drowning under economic pressures. So that. Well, are you optimistic that we can convey a message?
I'm not optimistic about anything, so let's say no.
So yeah, we won't ask you anything that has to do with, feeling happy today.
But it's like with everything. Like if you go to the movie theaters right now, most of what you're gonna see are blockbusters and the Marvel universe, which is kind of disgraceful and a bit worthy. But if you go to SAE movies, you might see something super interesting. And still, I mean, I believe cinema didn't die because Marvel became essentially the main mode of cultural production of the past three years. So I'm kind of pessimistic, but I don't think this will kill games as an expressive form or a self-reflexive form.
Yeah.
What do you think, Constantinos?
I would say that, actually killing interesting things is effectively impossible. You can even outlaw them and still, because I'm not very pessimistic, despite everything. So I tend to feel that you cannot really contain cinema to people with pointy ears who wear masks and their underwear on top of their clothes. So the superhero thing was a fad. I think it's almost over. I don't know. I haven't seen as many.
One can only hope.
Yes, I have this feeling that people who are actually able to do cinema are going back to the thing. There's gonna be there's gonna be an ebb and a flow and everything, but I think that people will start looking for meaning because they need it, because they need something that's not cynical. They need something that doesn't have a defined goal. And also because I'm also looking at the comments. For example, Revenger again notices that sometimes we everything has to lead to a material goal, but in reality, in this dreadful existential horror we're experiencing on a daily level. Escapism and just merely entertaining oneself, or just having fun, plain and simple, or just thinking about something that is not like crucial in a moment to day-to-day way. It's like you can think what is thought. It doesn't really matter what you come up with as an answer, but it's something that makes life worth living, perhaps, or answer something else. So I cannot imagine humanity moving beyond that, doing away with all of this. We just cannot.
Even when we think about the games industry, you know that most of the production, most of the business, and most of the players are consuming mindless casual games. That is the biggest share of the market. And yet we have great independent and semi-independent titles like The Outer Wilds, for example.
Mm.
And they're still possible, and they're still played, and they're getting more and bigger every year. Like even now, something that is called indie, at least as a vague encompassing label, is a generally big production that has a lasting heritage and great visibility. So I think, similar to you, despite the fact that a lot of crap and garbage is thrown to us in an attempt to captivate and distract us, there are still products out there that are not about being better than somebody else, are not about optimizing your resources and capturing all the Pokemons and building the biggest palace and conquering the world and going to space and those things.
Yeah. The truth be said, I mean, sometimes it does get depressing. Not with games as much, because you when you compare anything to Pac-Man, it's infinitely more like subtle and nuanced and everything. But I mean, when you talk about movies and you compare like the average blockbuster film to something like 70s cinema. Like, I mean, I recently watched Conformista, which was actually shot which was released in 1970, which is like a 50-year-old movie, and it was stunning. And you say, how come we lost that artistry? I mean, we should have moved forward in the past 50 years, which we did not. But yeah, things are always there for us to change, I believe. But wait. Also, questions are always asked for here to find in the stream and pose them to you. So wait. There's this idea of combining. Wait. We need video game making classes and tech classes that cover ideas beyond just the grid of programming and code, which I imagine, yeah, that we all agree. So question, since we're going into indie, those games are cool, but also much less in the mainstream compared to their bigger AAA brethren. How do we bring that mentality to the bigger industry? Or how do we get more folks interested in the indie and AA space? And Disco Elysium was one of the cool exceptions that broke into the mainstream. But yeah, how do we do that consistently? Obviously, I don't know. I have no answer. If Stefano has.
It's hard. Also, economically, it's less and less viable to be indie due to both competition, raising costs, and so on and so forth. So I don't know. Like the quick answer could be like, think of photography, right? Photography used to be a profession at the beginning of the century, right? In which like few people had a camera. And then slowly, this became something that everybody could afford and everybody could do in a smaller fashion, in maybe a less artistic or less technical fashion, until right now only very few professional photographers exist, but at the same time, everybody has a camera on their mobile phone, right? So how is this happening? I suppose that this is part of how when a medium penetrates society and certain practices emerging from that technology become familiar, then hopefully we will have a variety of contents coming out, from the stupid family party to the movie entirely shot with your mobile going to the cinema, like in the case of where there were some occasions of that one. I'm thinking, for example, have you seen a Polish movie called The Balcony Movie?
No.
Shot by quite a famous cinematographer during COVID, just taking shots of his life from his balcony. and it's done with very cheap equipment. And yet, if you go and check it out, it's a marvelous piece of
Mm.
cinema and sending out very powerful human messages about existence and happiness and what it's like to be here and what it's like to be here together. That, I mean, I challenge any kind of Marvel movie to contain a droplet of that done with a single camera from your own bedroom from a balcony. I mean,
No, that
I'm
sounds
thinking,
fascinating, actually.
see, look it up, like it's just a thought. It's made with one single camera, one audio little
Great.
thing in Poland, and that's incredible.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting on several levels too. I mean, even if it weren't as good as it apparently is, it would still be an interesting expression of creativity.
But you see, what the point I was trying to make is that
Mm.
the know-how and the technology to do something will become progressively more accessible. So how
Yeah.
do we make somebody creative and thoughtful with this? Well, it will naturally occur with more people trying to do this and people communicating through this as if it were like photographs or poems, right? Am I making sense? Did the fact that everybody can write kill creativity or give rise to a variety of literary genres and to an
Exactly.
avalanche of creators and the possibility to confront and talk to one another and build on each other's work? Like, I believe that in the long run this is
Mm.
going to be a positive thing, but there are several hiccups, mostly of the economic and ideological nature of
And
this.
yeah, I was about to say that the the solution to all those questions has to be political. So anything else is just, you know, um, by definition, it's going to be piecemeal, partial, or non-existent. So anyway, I want to see if we have any more questions because we just went past
Maybe
the
we're
hour.
boring everybody with this kind of old man.
Yeah. No, I think people are enjoying it because we have a really lively chat today.
Me and you,
So
certainly. I wonder about everybody else. We're like,
no, I
yes,
mean in the chat itself on YouTube. So question I want to ask you is like, would you like saying a few words about fictional games, which was like the book you published right before this one? And while you're doing that, like some one or two last questions, because we really have to um, slowly get to the
we
end
need to
of
slowly
the
wrap it up.
stream. Yeah,
So, since I cannot stop myself, I continue to write, and
thank
this
you.
is one of the books. It's called Fictional Games, and it came out with Bloomsbury. The cover is by the same person who did the art from the previous one, Rebecca Portelli, very good artist. I'm plugging her very, very much so. So, what is this about? Think about the fact that game studies, which is the discipline that studies, let's say, games and the way in which they're made and their cultural impact, similar to literary theory or movie studies or theater studies, just for games, normally focuses on the games that we play, the games that tradition passed down to us, or games that we're currently playing, or games that make us behave socially, whatever, like games that exist. In this book, we try to push the boundary of that discipline, which is game studies, onto looking at games that also don't exist. What do I mean by that? Games that we can never play as players, we can never experience as players. Think about, let's say, make an example, the Hunger Games, right? It has certain expressive functions within its titular book, but it's not something that is technologically or ethically possible in the society in which we live. And I'm sure that if you read science fiction or fantasy, or you like, for example, Yu-Gi-Oh! Well, that's a bad example because it happens quite often, like in the case of Quidditch, that fictional games are adapted, integrated, redesigned to become something playable, right? At that time, at that moment, they stop being fictional games. So, what do we do in these, as in this book? We look into very famous fictional games, try to categorize them into certain groups that are more or less interesting for the audience, discuss their philosophical relevance, and in total talk about 100 fictional games that go from, again, fantasies to science fiction movies, fictional games within games, and so on and so forth. The relation between a fictional game and a game that then was derived from a fictional game does not invalidate that the previous one is, I mean, does not stop the previous one from being a fictional game. I don't know if I made myself clear here. in the sense that the existence of a Quidditch that you can play on campus in the United States does not make the Quidditch in the book by J.K. Rowling less of a fictional game, right? So we're talking only about constructions that exist as games within a fiction and you cannot access as players. And there's a wealth of reflections, and there's a number of ways in which game studies can pick up and look into these particular new incredible features that we discovered and we've been loving for a long, long time. Think about, I don't know, like holochess in Star Wars, or, well, you can tell me which ones you like best. Gwent in The Witcher. Triple Triad, no, that's not. Triple Triad in Final Fantasy VIII is not a fictional game because it's playable from the beginning. Ooh, bad example. Can you think of Existence, the video game within the Cronenberg's movie, and so on and so forth? Like we discussed many of them, from very early literature up until like very recent science fiction movies, and try to make sense of this way of expressing ideas and societal and philosophical and so on. I hope this is kind of interesting. It's a nice little book full of examples and references, and I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, and thankfully I've actually read this one, so I can say I do enjoy it. And it was a great read. Very unique too.
Thank you. Let's hope that some people will continue the work. As a matter of fact, next year we will have a journal special issue of Eludamos, one of the key publications in game studies, doing a special issue on fictional games in which we invite people to write and analyze about fictional games that have a particular relevance, that are particularly interesting for academics. So that might be like a nice little continuation of this project.
Awesome. So I will pose one final question to you and then let you go do things.
Thanks.
Right. So,
well, before I finish, like, thank you again for having me and listening to me ramble. This is
seriously, man. It was thank you for being here. Like, thank you for taking the time and preparing this. That was lovely. But I also have to ask you this. So, Amy says that she instinctively knows what it is meant by the difference between a casual, simple game and a more complex, nuanced, and rich game. But once she tries to break it down, the distinction is less obvious. So she would like to hear how you might describe this divide, this distinction.
It's a very good question, and I don't want to ruin it with a bad answer, in a sense that there are attempts in game studies to nuance and break down that distinction between what is actually an indie game, what is not an indie game, what is a casual game, what is a non-casual game. Those dichotomies have been reworked and criticized in a number of different ways. If you want a rule of thumb, in general, a casual game is a game with very few mechanics that is focused on giving positive feedback to the player. In general, this is not very complicated, as much as possible as colorful, with a positive fiction. And the idea of juiciness is also an idea which is often reinforced in casual games, in the sense that everything you touch or every action you do the game responds to every action you do in a way that is detectable and pleasant, right? So in general, these games are quite simple and therefore can only vehicle messages that are already familiar to you in a sense. In fact, they are very stereotypical, these kind of games. They tend to be like match 3, jump at the right moment, Candy Crush-ish variations, and so on. So you tend to have a game with fixed screen, very positive feedback, very simple mechanics. Obviously, it's very hard to vehicle any message other than get good, you're doing fine, with those kind of languages, right? It's like a very, very restrictive genre to express yourself. And it doesn't need to become any more complicated than that, because it might as well be that some people just play games to hear how good they are and that something is progressing and colors are popping and sounds. And am I making sense here? Like, this is the biggest part of the population.
And I would say that this is not a bad thing, is it?
No, but it depends. Like you're asking me if McDonald's is a bad thing. Is quick, very appealing kind of food. If all you eat is McDonald's, then we have a health issue. Obviously. Casual games are tasty little snippets that are absolutely delicious, but at the same time that are not at all nutritious. So if you only fed your brain with casual games, you will probably start having some problems with how concentration, for example, or being taking care of tasks that require sacrifice and long concentration. Am I making sense here? So what I'm trying to say here is that there are other ways of using the game technology and lexicon to maybe slow down the pace and be less focused on success, action, and optimization of resources, and maybe make space for messages that help us think better about who we are and why we do things, and whether war is a good solution in this scenario or in this other scenario, right? It's hard to describe war, for example, or genocide as a positive or a negative thing in a casual game, because most of what we do is genocide and war to begin with, right? But if there were games with a language sophisticated enough to elaborate and nuance that argument, then we can take video games to a cultural level that is comparable to that of serious literature and serious cinema, and not just be an entertaining TV series or a casual game or a lunch at McDonald's. I guess.
No, I'm trying to think whether, for example, Mole Industria's games were very close. I mean, mechanically and in the way they were presented, they were very close to like your average casual game of the era, like the web-based. I mean, they used the form and
That
this
is
type
exactly that point, which is to reach a broader audience. What you can do is like use the form and then twist it.
exactly.
Many of the players of any kinds of race, ethnicity, literacy, age, and so on and so forth will be familiar with the mechanic. Only at the end you will see that something is twisted, something is weird, something is presented with a different kind of politics or point of view. So that is another power of casual games, but they work only because their language has been institutionalized, not really because they're great at expressing themselves. Am I making sense here?
Yes, good point. Yes.
Also, Paolo Pedercini of Mole Industria talks about it in similar terms, in which they're like little kind of candy with a strange interior that makes you wonder, why do I like
Paolo he's still making games as Mole Industria, right?
I believe so. I think
it's not mostly
not a couple of years back.
Yeah.
Maybe you can have Paolo and talk about his own vision on how games.
Because I mean, I haven't seen him since he last visited Greece, so it's been 4 years, 5 years, something like that. Before the well. Anyway, so seriously, since the time is really, really past what it should have been. Seriously, thanks a ton again, Stefano. Thanks for being here. Thanks for taking really the time for this fascinating presentation, and thank you all for actually participating and making this even more interesting than I imagined it would be. I mean, everyone was really into that. It wasn't just the two of us, and that was excellent. So once again, thanks a ton. Really looking forward to having you again, and not just hearing having you visit the country at some point again. That would be fun. And seriously, good night, and good night to all of you. So first off, seriously, thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Sorry for being like so rambly, and thank you for the great questions as well. Kostas, thank you so much for having me.
Seriously, a pleasure. Seriously.